Mr. Olympia 1996 wasn't just another edition of the biggest bodybuilding competition in the world. It marked the 32nd edition of an event that, by that point, was already shaping the future of professional bodybuilding. Anyone stepping on that stage wasn't fighting only for a title. They were fighting for a permanent place in bodybuilding history. The competition took place on September 21, 1996, at the iconic Ari Crown Theater in Chicago. With room for about 4,200 fans, the venue was completely packed with people who had traveled from all over the world. The energy was intense. Everyone in that room could feel it. Something big was about to go down. The event was organized by the IFBB, which at the time was riding the peak of professional bodybuilding. The 1990s are often seen as the sport's golden era, with athletes getting bigger, denser, and more conditioned than ever before. It was a moment when the standard physique was visibly changing right in front of the audience. Outside the stage, the world was going through a defining moment too. The United States was fully immersed in 90s pop culture. The NBA was at its peak with Michael Jordan dominating the league, and sports as entertainment had never been bigger. All of that helped turn Mr. Olympia into something far beyond a contest. It was a full-blown cultural event. That same level of intensity showed up in the prize money. A total of $275,000 in awards made Mr. Olympia 1996 one of the most lucrative editions in history up to that point. But the real question was simple. Who would walk away with the ultimate title? Would it be another predictable win, or the start of a historic shift in bodybuilding? Mr. Olympia 1996 went down as one of the most brutal and competitive lineups of all time. Never before had so many massive, dense, extreme physiques shared the same stage. This wasn't just about trophies. It was about pushing the human body to its absolute limits in professional bodybuilding. That's exactly why this Olympia became known as Monsters of the Midway. The nickname wasn't hype, it was literal. The athletes who stepped on stage in Chicago looked like they had completely redefined size, muscle thickness, and visual impact. Every comparison felt more shocking than the last, especially when competitors turned their backs to the judges. This era marked a clear turning point in bodybuilding aesthetics. The classic look, focused on smooth lines and balanced proportions, was starting to fade. In its place, judges were rewarding something very different: insane mass, extreme density, and a commanding presence on stage. Back poses became the ultimate deciding factor. Looking big from the front wasn't enough anymore. It was in the back poses, the rear lat spread and the rear double biceps, where the true monsters separated themselves from everyone else. If you didn't have thickness, detail, and depth, you simply vanished in comparisons. And that brings up an important question. Did this new standard elevate the sport or permanently change its direction? Some fans fell in love with the raw visual impact of this era, while others missed the classic aesthetic. If you had been sitting in the front row at Mr. Olympia 1996, which side would you have been on? When the show kicked off, one thing was already clear. Dorian Yates wasn't just another champion defending his title. He arrived in Chicago as a four-time consecutive winner, carrying the weight of maintaining a new physical standard that he himself had created. The big question was straightforward. Could anyone stop him? That night sealed Dorian Yates' fifth straight Mr. Olympia title, locking in his status as the dominant bodybuilder of the 1990s. More than just winning trophies, Yates changed the game. He didn't just beat other competitors, he shattered old ideas of what a Mr. Olympia physique was supposed to look like. His biggest revolution was his back. Unmatched thickness, extreme density, and a level of detail that simply didn't exist before him. While other athletes impressed from the front, the moment Yates turned around, the contest was basically decided. His legendary lower back, Christmas tree, became a symbol of total dominance. In 1996, there was also a new challenge in play: the real possibility of anti-doping tests for diuretics. Even so, Yates showed up in razor-sharp condition. He later admitted he might have looked a bit flatter than usual, but it didn't matter. His overall physique, especially in the back poses, the rear lat spread and rear double biceps, was still completely out of reach for every other competitor on that stage. The final results confirmed exactly what the judges had seen in the comparisons. First place across the scorecards, the top prize of $110,000, and a fifth Sando trophy for Dorian Yates. But while first place felt almost locked in, the real war at Mr. Olympia in 1996 happened right behind him. That's where the stage turned into a battleground between two completely opposite bodybuilding philosophies. On one side, pure aesthetics. On the other, mass taken to the extreme. And the crowd felt that clash in every single comparison. Shawn Ray was the embodiment of classic aesthetics taken to perfection. Shorter in stature, but flawless in proportions, symmetry, and conditioning, Ray walked on stage knowing he couldn't beat anyone on sheer size. His game plan was different. Beat everyone on quality, pose by pose, detail by detail. Over his career, Shawn Ray achieved something incredibly rare: 11 consecutive top 5 finishes at the Mr. Olympia. In 1996, many fans, including plenty inside the theater, believed he had done enough to win. When his name was announced in second place, boos echoed through the Ari Crown Theater, making it clear that, for a large part of the audience, the decision wasn't that straightforward. On the opposite side stood Nasser El Sonbati, who chose a completely different path. Instead of refining lines, Nasser decided to challenge Dorian Yates on his own turf, size and mass. The result was a colossal physique that finally allowed him to stand toe-to-toe with the champion in direct comparisons, something very few competitors had managed up to that point. Nasser won a few specific poses, especially where his arms and delts really stood out. He originally finished in third place, extremely close to Shawn Ray in the battle for second. At that moment, the showdown between aesthetics and mass felt perfectly balanced, almost like a physical representation of the debate dividing bodybuilding fans worldwide. But that story wasn't over yet. Just weeks after Mr. Olympia in 1996 ended, news broke that completely changed how that podium was viewed. The results of the anti-doping tests for diuretics, announced about a month after the show, hit the bodybuilding world like a bomb. What seemed decided on stage was about to take an unexpected turn off stage. The name at the center of the controversy was Nasser El Sonbati. He tested positive for diuretics, drugs used to eliminate water retention and enhance muscle definition. As a result, Nasser was officially disqualified, lost his third-place finish, and was required to return his $30,000 prize money. That impressive performance suddenly carried a very different weight. With his disqualification, the entire lineup below him shifted. Kevin Levrone, Flex Wheeler, Paul Dillett, Ronnie Coleman, and the rest of the competitors all moved up one spot, and several athletes received financial adjustments to their prize payouts. One important detail: unlike other famous cases in Olympia history, Nasser did not contest the result. He publicly admitted that he gambled on the possibility that there would be no testing, and lost that gamble. This episode became a defining moment in the Mr. Olympia's anti-doping control, making it clear that the era of anything goes was coming to an end. From that point on, the risk became very real for everyone on stage. Even so, Nasser's story didn't end there. But that's a topic for another video. Behind the title fight, the top 6 at Mr. Olympia 1996 was filled with stories that could each be entire chapters in bodybuilding history. Every athlete just below the top represented a different path within a sport that was living its most extreme phase. Understanding those stories helps explain why this Olympia is still talked about today. Kevin Levrone was, to many, the almost perfect package. Round delts, full arms, powerful legs, and an aesthetic that grabbed attention instantly. In 1996, however, he didn't arrive at his absolute peak. Even so, after Nasser's disqualification, he officially finished in third place, reinforcing his reputation as the eternal contender, always close to the top, but never quite at the very top. Right behind him was Flex Wheeler, often called the greatest bodybuilder to never win a Mr. Olympia. In Chicago, Flex showed up bigger than ever, with his classic structure still intact. The problem was water retention, which robbed him of the sharp definition needed to challenge higher placings. The result was a fourth-place finish, deeply frustrating for someone with true champion-level talent. Paul Dillett was probably the most visually shocking athlete at first glance. From the front, he looked almost unbeatable: massive arms, huge shoulders, a tight waist, and powerful legs. But once he turned around, his main weakness became obvious. The judges once again split the difference, and Dillett finished in fifth place, repeating a pattern that had followed him in previous years. And then there was Ronnie Coleman. In 1996, he wasn't that Ronnie Coleman yet, the legend the world would come to know later on. He originally placed 7th and moved up to 6th after the disqualification. Mr. Olympia in 1996 reached such an insane level that simply missing the final pose down was already a sign of greatness. To give you an idea of how deep that lineup was, extremely respected athletes didn't even make the final comparisons, something almost unthinkable in other editions. That alone shows how high the bar was that year. One of the clearest examples was Chris Cormier. Known for his aesthetics, classic lines, and strong stage presence, Cormier was coming off 2 straight 6th-place finishes at the Olympia. In 1996, however, the competition was so stacked that even with a solid, competitive physique, he failed to make the pose down. Not because he lacked quality, but because there were simply too many giants on that stage. Another name that stood out, even without fighting for the top spots, was Jean-Pierre Fuchs. The Swiss rookie shocked everyone with his sheer size, something rare for a first-timer. His conditioning was still inconsistent, but his muscle mass made one thing clear: a new mass monster was on the rise. Just months later, he would confirm that potential in European competitions. And even though Ronnie Coleman had already been mentioned, it's worth emphasizing, he didn't make the initial pose down either. Looking back now, that sounds almost unbelievable. The event also carried an emotional weight that wasn't visible on stage. The absence of Andreas Munzer, who had passed away just months earlier, hung over the competition. His death shocked the sport and accelerated major changes in anti-doping rules, especially regarding diuretics. In many ways, Olympia 1996 marked not just a physical peak, but a turning point in bodybuilding's awareness and responsibility. After intense comparisons, boos, applause, and plenty of controversy, Mr. Olympia 1996 finally reached its official conclusion. What remained wasn't just a list of names, but a true snapshot of an era when bodybuilding hit extreme levels of competitiveness. Every placing told its own story. At the top, Dorian Yates confirmed his absolute dominance, leaving Chicago as champion for the 5th straight time. Right behind him, Shawn Ray secured 2nd place, reinforcing his status as the greatest representative of classic aesthetics in the middle of the monster era. With the later disqualification, Kevin Levrone officially inherited 3rd place, followed by Flex Wheeler in 4th and Paul Dillett in 5th. 6th place went to Ronnie Coleman, a name that, at the time, seemed simply promising, but would go on to completely dominate the sport just a few years later. The standings continued with Chris Cormier in 7th, Jean-Pierre Fuchs in 8th, Charles Claremont in 9th, and Mike Francois rounding out the top 10. The rest of the lineup included Aaron Baker, Roland Zierlock, and Mike Matarazzo, all competing on one of the toughest Olympia stages in history. Nasser El Sanbadi finished the night in 3rd place, but was officially disqualified weeks later. Those results closed the book on Mr. Olympia 1996, but left one big question hanging in the air. Did that ranking represent the ultimate peak of the mass monster era? Or was it just the final great chapter before an inevitable shift in the sport? Mr. Olympia 1996 didn't really end when the stage lights went dark in Chicago. In many ways, that's when its true impact began. That event definitively cemented the mass monster era, making it clear that bodybuilding had crossed a point of no return in terms of size, density, and sheer physical brutality. At the same time, Olympia 1996 pushed the debate between aesthetics and extreme size to a whole new level. On one side, harmonious, proportional, technically flawless physiques. On the other, massive, dense bodies with overwhelming visual impact. That clash split fans, athletes, and even judges, and it's still being argued about today, nearly 3 decades later. Another key point is that, even though it was yet another dominant win, this Olympia quietly foreshadowed the end of Dorian Yates' reign. Very few people realized it at the time, but 1996 was the last year Yates stepped on stage fully healthy. The following year, he would retire, closing the chapter on an era he had personally created. The event also served as a historical bridge. On one side, the absolute dominance of Yates. On the other, the first clear signs of Ronnie Coleman's rise, a man who would, just a few years later, redefine the standard of the sport all over again. Mr. Olympia 1996 was, quite literally, the transition point between 2 legendary reigns. Because of all that, Mr. Olympia 1996 is still remembered as one of the most impactful, controversial, and heavily debated events in bodybuilding history. It wasn't just a competition, it was a snapshot of an extreme, intense, and unforgettable era. Mr. Olympia 1996 wasn't just another contest. It was one of those rare moments when a sport pauses, redefines itself, and is never quite the same again. It was the peak of the mass monster era, the ultimate collision between aesthetics and extreme size, and the stage where some legends were reaching the end of their cycle, while others didn't even know yet that they would dominate the future. That's probably why, even after all these years, this Olympia still sparks debate, strong opinions, and divided passions. Some see it as the absolute peak of bodybuilding. Others see it as the beginning of excesses that changed everything. And now the question goes straight to you. In your opinion, did Mr. Olympia 1996 represent the highest point of the sport, or the start of a path with no return? If this video helped you see this story from a new perspective, hit that like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing you deep, well-researched content like this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next videos on the biggest moments, legends, and controversies in bodybuilding. And if you want to support the channel even more, become a member and be part of our community. Now, before you go, check out the video already waiting for you on the end screen. A story that connects directly to everything we talked about here. Click it, stick with us, because in bodybuilding, just like in history, there's always another chapter waiting.